okay, here's this guy using comic books. And for some of the kids, it's a weird experience because they've never read one at all. And they certainly have never read one in a classroom before. And so it starts to open up the idea of what history really is, what social studies really is. It's a lot more than just what's in that textbook. You want to talk about these heavy topics, right? And you want to get into these things, but you hand a kid a comic that looks fun, that's engaging, that is still hitting these topics on, and it opens up those conversations. As I'm seeing comics majors, as I'm seeing all these things at the university level start to change, I really do see in the next few years, there's going to be very few people left that are going to be able to say, comic books aren't real reading. And that makes me really happy.
Hi Tim, how are you?
Good morning. How's it going?
Good morning. It's been going well. Thank you so much for joining me today at We Are Mentally United podcast. I'm highly inspired by your work. I'm highly inspired by the different techniques that you have been using in teaching in the world of teaching and stuff. So thank you so much for being here today.
No, I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Definitely. And for folks who may not know of you or may have not heard of your work, how can you give you a little brief introduction?
Sure. So I have been a high school social studies teacher for about 23 years now, and I run teachingwithcomics.com. It's a website. So I get to go around the country and I do professional development at Comic Cons and universities, libraries all over the place of using comics to teach kids. And I'm also the author. Actually, today is the 2-year anniversary of my first book called Teaching with Comics and Graphic Novels.
Wow, beautiful timing. I'm so glad that we are recording it today. And today, folks, is the 6th of July. So how did this journey begin, Tim?
Do you mean teaching or when I started reading comics or using comics in my classroom? There's all kinds of beginning parts.
Let's start off from the very top, from the very beginning. Like what first introduced you to comics, or how did you get interested in it when you were a little kid?
Yeah, so I have an origin story like actually I'm finding a lot of people do in comic books, both creators and readers, is I had kind of a rough childhood. There was some abuse involved and things like that. And it was comics, specifically things like the X-Men, where here's a group of kids who went through really rough backgrounds, a lot of times were even disowned by their parents, by their communities, and yet they found a safe place. They found a place to go to. They didn't give up on the world. They decided they still wanted to make it a better place for people like them. An origin story like Bruce Wayne, whose parents were killed, he didn't give up. He decided to go out and still want to make the world a better place. And it sounds kind of cheesy, but again, it's a lot of people that I find in the comic book world who did have a troubled childhood and kind of have a similar story where comic books were accepting to them, and it became a safe place.
I feel like they provide stories of resilience. They provide stories of extremely powerful characters, whether those be good or whether those be bad. And there is a lot people can relate to. Do you remember the first few comics that you read?
Well, I remember the first two comics that I finally had enough money to buy, and it was the very first Transformer comic book and the very first G.I. Joe comic book, by Larry Hama, who is still writing G.I. Joe today. And it was just, in those cases, it was just the idea that there's a whole universe with the Transformers and everything that are out there that we never really thought about or considered. So it was sci-fi, it was imagination, the huge colors, the covers of the comic books that drew me in as a kid. And then G.I. Joe, my dad was in the army, and you hear all those heroic stories as a young man, and again, that kind of really inspired me too. And then I just kind of branched out from there.
Very nice. And how old were you at this time?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess elementary school, but I don't know exactly the age.
Very nice. And during at that time and in that era, were comics books very common among the community members or like around in school?
No, so it's kind of what makes it hard sometimes with comic books is, you have to go to the comic book store. It wasn't like in the previous generation really where you could buy comics at the drugstore or the You had to go to a specific place. And so, I was a kid in Philadelphia. I didn't really have a lot of access to those kinds of places. And so it kind of was tough, but I would walk quite a bit to go to the comic book store, and you would just kind of save up your money. But if Christmas, birthday parties, and things like that, that's always the gift that I would ask for. And it's kind of nice now that I'm turning 50 and I have adult money. I'm able to go buy the comic books that I wanted when I was a kid and kind of fill in those gaps.
It's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And as you were growing up, were friends around the friends that you had, were they also into a lot of comics and stuff?
So I tell a story all the time. The two things I love the most are hip hop and comic books. And so, I could talk about Public Enemy and Chuck D and, all those things with my friends, and that was dope and that was cool and that was all those things. But no, I didn't really feel comfortable talking about the nerdy side of my life really until I was an adult. I think, at that time, you would have gotten your butt beaten maybe or picked on by talking about comic books as a kid. But now I have three children of my own, and that has changed a lot. Being called a nerd is like a badge of honor today. It's seen as a form of intelligence and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish that that culture was around when I was a kid. And it wasn't such an isolated community. But now, if you go to a comic book store, they're so accepting, so welcoming, and it's such a great community to be a part of.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like that shift has happened very recently, probably in the last 10 to 20 years with probably movies. What would you say? What changed that
It,
perspective?
it, it was the Marvel movies, 100%, absolutely. Although I would say when Tim Burton's original Batman came out, that had a huge impact too, but not the impact that like the first Iron Man movie did with Robert Downey Jr. That just really changed everything. And I think what it did was it brought my generation together with a younger generation, and then also our parents' generation. And all of a sudden, like through Star Wars and things like that, like my kids are reading and watching a lot of the same things I did as a kid, and some of the same things that my own dad did when he was a kid. And I think it just really just kickstarted everything.
Yeah, I remember I was growing up I grew up in Pakistan, and over there they do have a huge following around comic books and stuff, but accessibility is a big option. You really have to be involved and invested in it to know the places from where you can buy the books. And my first door towards the comic books was Batman, the one that was directed by Christopher Nolan, because I'm a big cinema buff. So when that movie came out, I saw it and I was so invested in Batman's character, and that I went to those stores and I found those stores, like, because they were difficult to be accessed by, and brought a lot of Batman comic books. So for me also, I feel like that was a main transition point.
Yeah, that's cool. So for both of us, it was kind of Batman with the movies. I've done some work with the U.S. State Department, and we've worked with teachers and students in Pakistan and India and Asia and Europe and Africa. And what's cool now is a lot of the comics accessibility has become easier because you can buy and read a lot of them online. And I think that's been a game changer for people too.
Yeah, the online stuff has been a big game changer because now you can access even the most rarest ones are also available online to be read. I remember growing up also, one of the more common comics were the Archie's comics back home. For some reason, they were at every other stall and they were very highly accessible.
That's it's actually my daughter who is going to college in a couple months. That's her favorite comic, or Archie Comics. So they're very much still around. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, when you were growing up, did you ever envision that this would be something that you'd also be implementing so heavily in your career?
No, no. In fact, it was years of being kind of a by the book kind of a teacher, where I was teaching literature and real history, and all those kinds of things. And I never even thought about using comic books in my classroom, or Star Trek or Star Wars or any of those things. And it was Miles Morales when he came out. So Miles Morales, who's biracial, identifies Black Puerto Rican SpiderMan. When he came out, I just happened to start talking about it in my classroom, and I was like, "Oh, this is really cool." And I had a young Black student who was kind of on the quiet side. He was a little bit nerdy, like I was when I was his age, And he stayed after class to talk to me about how much that meant to him that Spider-Man looked like him, right? So the United States had, Barack Obama, right? We had our first black president. That didn't impress him as much as the fact that Spider-Man was black. And so I was like, oh, okay, so we're on to something. And then I just started incorporating pop culture, hip hop, comic books, all those things into my classroom. And I actually wrote an article for PBS on this of it doing this being the teacher that I wanted to be made me fall in love with teaching like all over again. And that when I talk to college students and education majors, that's my big point is find that thing that you love that you can bring into your classroom because when the teacher's passionate about things, the kids are passionate about things, and it becomes quite a neat experience when you do it that way.
That's beautiful. That's really, really beautiful because I work in the world of therapy and I've seen a lot of work that you do with have been doing within your community utilizing comics. And I've used comics in some of my sessions and the breakthroughs in those sessions have been tremendous because people have spoken about kids have been able to express their emotions effectively. They've been able to identify their emotions through those storytellings when they make the bad guy win. It really helps me tap into their inner feelings or their inner trauma where they probably identify themselves as the bad guy because they're perceived that way within their community or they're bullied a lot where they feel like something's wrong with them. So it's remarkable work and that you're doing with the books and utilizing comics.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing that as well. And I find that all the time. So play therapy, right, is a really powerful thing when you have the kids model. But when a lot of times when we have kids create comics and make their own stories, those things come out. And even with my high school kids. So like, and we've had some really powerful conversations in my classroom because they see the books that are in my classroom of all different walks of life and identity and race and these things. And so they feel comfortable. And I've had students create modern fairy tales. So we talk about like the Grimm brothers and the unification of Germany and how important folk tales and fairy tales are to people. And so they create their own modern fairy tales. And a lot of times they recreate stories on a theme of LGBTQ. Or they create a story in some cases where they haven't even talked to other people about who they are and they feel like they're able to put it down on paper for the first time in a really safe space. And students have shared some really deep and meaningful stories with one another. And it opens up conversations in my classroom to so much. Um, and I open up to my students as well about the things that I went through, my failings, my successes, and I do that in the beginning of the year, and it just changes. I think the atmosphere of the classroom, that trust level of being open, and so then when you're teaching about something that happened 800 years ago, that you have the kids, they feel connected. When something scary happens around the world, you already have that relationship with the kids, and so you're able to have those conversations um, in a way that you probably wouldn't be able to without opening those conversations. Like again, for me, a lot of the times through comic books.
Yeah. How important do you think is teaching them or talking to them about failures? Because a lot of time folks concentrate more towards the success, which I feel like is also important, but sometimes that could build up a character where if you face failure, you might hit yourself too hard.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I have stopped lessons in the middle of a lesson because I'm like, this is not working. What would you guys do differently? How can you? And so I ask the students for feedback. So if they're giving a presentation or they're doing and they get stuck, it's not the end of the world. Like it happens. And I give presentations around the world. And I screw things up and I get stuck and it happens. And I think a lot of times teachers can be just kind of the grader in the room and not the active participant. So I share the kids what I do. And when I learn from the kids, which I love to do, but I also share, when I was in college, depression hit me really, really hard. My childhood kind of caught up to me and I wound up dropping out of college. I didn't go through the traditional route. And it was through reaching out, it was through who is now my wife, Joan, um, was able to help me through all that. And so I went back to college, and I wanted to be the teacher that I needed when I was a kid. And I wouldn't be the person I am if I didn't go through some of these failures. And it's also realizing too, as an adult, that a lot of those failures weren't my fault, that there's things that happened to
Mm-hmm.
me that were beyond my control. And you say that to a 15, 16-year-old kid who's going through those exact things at that moment. I think it's a really powerful thing to do. It's scary to do, but
It builds up your character, it builds up your resiliency, I feel like, throughout that journey. And then how would you utilize comics to teach tough topics or to talk up and have conversations around tough topics?
I would say probably the two that I use the most, Champions, which is the modern kind of superhero team, with a Korean Hulk and really cool kind of characters. My favorite superhero team. But in Champions number 24, came out a few years ago, authored by Jim Zub. There's a school shooting in Miles Morales' high school, right? In Spider-Man's high school, and he's not there. And he has a lot of guilt over it. And so the comic is about these things that happen. And it's about where he's about ready to give up because he says, these things happen and this violence happens, and, people get upset and we all speak and we're going to change things. And then everything gets quiet and then it happens again. And then the message of the comic is about not giving up, about voting, about using your civic rights and those sorts of things. Um, and so I bought like 35 copies of that comic when it came out, and I use it in my classroom every year because pop culture represents what's around us. It's an artifact, right? Our TV shows, our movies, our music, and so that's really impactful for my students. We have these active shooter drills every year. Like that's a reality for our students. I mean, my daughter has done them since kindergarten, and it's terrifying. And I think a lot of times we don't talk to the kids about what's going on, and about their feelings, and it's just another thing that we do. And so for me, it's a way for me not to lecture. It's I'm not telling them about what's going on. It's a way for them to sit and to read and to reflect, and say, hey, this isn't our comic books. Like this is how much of this is an issue, that it's also in our comic books now. And then the other one that I use every year is Amazing Spider-Man number 36. So this is Spider-Man is at ground zero on 9/11. Marvel Comics decided to make 9/11 part of the Marvel universe because Marvel takes place in real places, right? It's not Gotham, it's New York City, it's those sorts of things. And so I know my youngest daughter had come home upset from school one year because her teacher had shown a video, and in the video, people were jumping from one of the towers. And my daughter was very young at the time, and she was very upset. And the teachers, some of my age, like I started teaching the day before 9/11. I think we can dump too much of our emotional baggage on the kids, right, who weren't even alive now when it happened. So when she came home and she was so upset, and so her mind had shut down. She wasn't going to pay attention to what the teacher's lesson was. We read this comic together, and here were superheroes who were struggling with that day, who reflected the way that America was feeling. Captain America, he reflects back on seeing Pearl Harbor. You've got Doctor Doom even comes to help, and kind of cheesily, like he sheds a tear. And what happens in the comics, and it also shows reaction from around the world. So there are some in the Middle East, who are celebrating or are very excited. And there's also those in the Middle East who are very upset and very sad. And it kind of leads us to that conversation of there were all these feelings from around the world at the same time. It wasn't just us versus them. There should not be an us, kind of an idea. And then by the end of the story, what you realize is the real heroes of the day were the police officers, the firefighters, the ambulance drivers, the doctors, the nurses. And so, is it a Mr. Rogers quote? I forget, but it's look for the helpers in time of trouble. And I think that comic very much brings that out, that it wasn't the superheroes, it wasn't these fictional characters, but it was very real people, who helped us out. And so through those two comic books, it then kind of opens up a whole different level of conversation in my classroom. I think not just because of the topics, but also okay, here's this guy using comic books. And for some of the kids, it's a weird experience because they've never read one at all. And they certainly have never read one in a classroom before. And so it starts to open up the idea of what history really is, what social studies really is. It's a lot more than just what's in that textbook.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that because I feel like I personally had never heard about either of these comic books, so I'll definitely give it a watch and give it a read for sure. But telling stories or communicating or utilizing storytelling to communicate such difficult and tough topics is very challenging. It's within itself, but utilizing it to inspire and educate students, I think that's a really great initiative. Uh, do you see other teachers also utilizing some similar strategies or coming up to you at your school and asking you around tips on how it could be done?
No. And that's what's funny is I do work with educators around the world. So that's what's great about social media and online, and you get to meet your people, right? That and there's so many fantastic educators doing what I do. But there's really nobody else in my district who does what I do. I'm lucky to work in a district that allows their teachers to be who they are. And so I don't have to teach exactly the same way that somebody else is. We have common tests, common midterms and finals and things like that. So there are some commonalities, right? If we're teaching the same course, but they don't so we exchange some lessons sometimes, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same way. And so to me, that's fine. And so I get to learn from them because I do things differently than I do, and they've come to some of my talks and they can learn from me. But nobody really is as big of a nerd in my district as I am in teaching the way that I do, which is fine.
What are the students' reaction? They must love you.
Um, yeah, I had so again, there's kids who have never read a comic book before. There are kids in like my honors classes who in the beginning of the year they're a little insulted because they think comic books are beneath them. But then when we start doing the things that I do, it kind of blows their minds a little bit of it's not just like bow, pam, zap, kind of the old Batman kind of a thing. I did have one student one year really hated comic books. And I don't teach a comic book class. It's we use all different resources. And so I had a meeting with that. So this is March, based on the life of Congressman John Lewis during the Civil Rights Movement, the most powerful books I've ever used. Um, so the dad came in and he was rightfully defending his daughter, and I all I did in the whole meeting, I said, just read this. And so he's sitting in front of me and he starts reading through the March graphic novel and he goes, I don't know what her problem is. This is fantastic. And, we were talking about John Lewis and students, and I never won her back. Like, she just didn't like comic books. And what I try to get across to the dad is we're going to do other things too. We use the traditional textbook. We're going to use music. We're going to use poetry. We're going to all these different things. And that's okay. Like, we try to reach every student where they are and their different strengths and their different passions and things like this. But yeah, that was the only experience that I had. But yeah, I think for the most part, kids love it because they've never done it before. Because they get to draw in my class, they get to create history comics in my class. And I've had parents come to my classroom because they want to see it, because their kids are talking about my classroom. There are comics and posters and everything around my room. And what I try to make sure is that when somebody walks into my room, they literally see themselves in something in my room. It's not bare walls. It's not just, those sorts of things. And so more times than not, during parent conferences, I wind up talking to the parents about comic books or movies and things like that. So and even that makes it a lot friendlier of an experience rather than teacher versus parent, kind of a thing.
Yeah, no, I was asking this to you because currently I'm providing therapy services at a clinic, but before that I was working at two different elementary schools. And in one of those elementary schools, my office was inside the library. So I had a room inside the library where I would bring kids in for sessions. And I would see them get so excited around the library time and just be so happy and so well regulated as compared to being how dysregulated they used to get within their classrooms with the teachers and stuff. So it was very eye-opening and it was very inspiring to see because we we talk and we think that we live in a world of technology and or technology is overtaking everything. But even this at this day at an elementary school, kids get so happy when they enter a library.
Yeah, I have multiple lessons where literally the lesson is that we sit and read. And so a lot of times what I'll do is we're not always reading the same book together. So like if we're, let's just say World War II, I'll put like 20 different books on 7 different tables. And the kids do like a book tasting, and there's comic books and there's picture books and there's kid books and there's college level books and there's all these things, and literally the lesson is sit and read and just reflect on what you learned today. So they're not answering 30 questions. They're not, doing all those sorts of things. They can read the book that they feel comfortable with, that they're interested with. They're forced to talk to their partners because they're reading different books. It's all in the same topic, same time period. And they love that. There's no computer. Like all of our school, our district, every kid is issued a computer. There's no computers for those time periods. And they love that because even our textbooks a lot of times are on the computer. And the kids will say that all the time, that they love that they have that quiet time to sit and read and talk about books and to draw and to create, and to do arts and crafts and the things that sometimes we can forget about.
Yeah. How do you come up with these plans and these the lesson plans and the ideas? How does that process look like to you?
Well, I'm lucky enough. I have like Scholastic, Macmillan, and others. They hire me a lot of cases to write teacher guides, for their graphic novels and comics and things like that. And really, it's just like I'll give you an example. Like here's Laurie Halse Anderson's Speak, and any book I read, any book a teacher reads, like this is what you do. You annotate it, you note it.
Wow.
How can I use this in my classroom? How can I this and the other? Um, and so I don't know. There's no specific process. It is a very creative process, when teachers go through materials and come up with ways to use it. But I will say that one of my favorite lessons to do is, like I said, like specifically like with the March graphic novels, is I'll put graphic novels out on the desk and sticky notes. And so I say to the kids, when you're reading, and I show them how I do it, right? And I share examples and things like that. And I say, so put in a sticky note whenever you feel moved. It could be an exclamation point, a question mark, sometimes I get a, WTF, because it's one of those moments. And so initially that's terrifying to kids because they'll say, well, how many sticky notes do we have to put in? How many questions do we have to answer? Because we're so used to giving them the rubric, the guided reading, that this is what you have to do. And so if I were to say you have to put in 10 sticky notes, there are kids who would do 10 sticky notes and then nothing more because that's all they have to do. So by me not doing that, their kids turn in these books that are like so wide open because there's so many sticky notes in them. And it's amazing experience. And again, it was terrifying the first time I did it because I was turning control over from me to the students. Uh,
Hmm.
and so with that, a lot of times the kids, when I go through the reactions, I go through their things, they pitch me ideas. They give me feedback. They say, hey, next year, why don't you try to do this? Or maybe you should include that question. Or this one didn't really work for me. And I think it's by me being a reader, of comics and prose and everything else, that leaves me open to those ideas. And again, I didn't do this originally as a teacher. It took me a long time to get to that comfort level. And I wish we could teach more teachers to do that sooner in their careers.
How important would you say is taking feedback from the students?
Yeah, I think it's paramount, and it's not like the end of the year survey, that a lot of teachers, at myself, that we do. It's I give my kids probably three surveys through the marking period, so they wind up through the year with so 4 times. So what's that? 12 times a year, they're given written feedback to me about how are things going, not just with my classroom, but also with them. What's going on? What's something that you would like to talk about in this class? What's something that we're missing? What are your questions? What are your concerns? How can I help you? A lot of times it's great when I ask, what's your favorite song you're listening to right now? what's a book that what's a TV show? And so it's not just about the content, that kind of helps with that. But it really is where I tell the kids, like, hey, I tried this 2 years ago and I fell on my face. And so we want to teach the kids how to be analytical and how to evaluate things. So that's one of the things we can do is by having them pick me apart, um,
Mm-hmm.
it is a really powerful thing for them to do. And it allows them to be more open to my feedback because I'm open to their feedback. And so it has to be a two-way street. It can't just me being saying, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. But also with that feedback, it also has to be me pointing out what they're doing right. And I say to the kids, even if you failed an assignment, I could almost always find something in there that is brilliant. Um, and even high school kids, like if I put a sticker on their paper, like that's like they're so excited to get a sticker as a high school kid because a lot of times they don't. And then there's even times, so then later on in the year when I do things like a research paper, I will give them back my feedback without a grade. And so they have to then go through and they have to evaluate. This is hard to do. They have to evaluate themselves. They have to give themselves a grade and they have to tell me why they graded themselves in that way. Because what I was finding is, I spend, 40 minutes grading a kid's research paper and I hand it back to them. They look at the grade and they never look at it again. They throw it away, put it in their backpack, whatever. But now, because we've gone through months now of back and forth giving each other feedback, they now have to turn that on themselves. And it's not just me. And so what'll happen is I'll say, okay, well, here's my grade. So we'll meet. Here's my grade. Here's your grade. So let's put these together. Let's come up with what your grade is. And what I find is a lot of times the kids are way too hard on themselves. And so that conversation a lot of times becomes a really great conversational piece because now it's not just about the letter grade, it's about this whole process. And so again, this is not, I can't just start this process in April. This has to begin the beginning of the school year. And I think in a lot of ways, it's with comic books because I'll use comic books without any words on the pages. For instance, Nat Turner by Kyle Baker. It's about Nat Turner's rebellion in the United States, and the entire graphic novel is wordless. And what the kids have to do is go through and they tell me what they think is happening on each page. And so initially they'll come up to me and they'll say, "Hey, Mr. Smyth, I don't understand. What do you think? What's going on here?" I'm like, "I don't know. That's up to you. What do you think is going on there?" And what it allows them to do is realize that you can have 30 different interpretations of the same page and all be correct. But why? Why do you think that way? Why do you feel that way? And I think education needs to be the same way. It's if I give you feedback on a test and you disagree with my feedback, I welcome the kids to respectfully come and talk to me about it. And a lot of the times the kids will force me to look at it in a way. I'm like, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying there. And I'll change the point value. And that all has to start from, like I said, the very first week of school.
Well, no, it's really important to make kids feel empowered enough to speak up and share their opinions and their thoughts in classes. And a lot of time, I feel like teachers also have to evolve with the process and with the students. They cannot stick up to that same ideology or the same ways that they have been teaching for the last few years. Um, have you seen that in your practice, and how would how would you talk about that?
Well, I think for me, what changed everything was COVID. Is I realized how important a teacher could be with students because this happened in was it like March? It's somewhere now
March
pointing
of
to
2020,
yeah.
if I'm not wrong, yeah.
And so we already built up this classroom community, right? We already had this feedback. And all of a sudden now, in this really scary time, nobody knows what's happening, what's going to go on. I am conversing with students at midnight, at 1 o'clock. Kids are talking. We also were having the Black Lives Matter protests, and all, so much was happening in the United States. And my kids reached out to me and they wanted to meet as a class and they wanted to, we would do things like Flipgrid where the kids would record videos and they would give feedback to one another. They wanted to be together. And that COVID really made like just cemented everything for me about how important it is to build that community in the classroom. And, like when I first started teaching, it was here's the textbook, Here's my rules. Here's why you must be afraid of me. Don't, all that's how I like, what was the saying? Don't let the students see you smile until Christmas. That was literally what I was told when I first started teaching. And that has all changed so much for the better. But for me personally, it was COVID. And like I said, I worked with the State Department and we were teaching online, educator and student cohorts around the world, and we were all going through COVID. It was really scary and comforting all at the same time that we were seeing a lot of things in common. And for me, it made the world a lot smaller in a really powerful way. And so then I also try to do that with my students and try to get them to interact with classrooms from other countries. And a lot of times we wind up talking about American comic books. So
That's amazing. Comic books also really challenge up your creativity, really let you push your imagination and stuff. How important do you think that is for kids or for students within schools?
well, I'm gonna kind of answer the question. Not sure exactly the way it's being asked, but I think sometimes what people they look at a comic book and they just see like, okay, this is childish, this is this, that, and the other. What they don't understand is like the gutter between the panels, right? So there's panel one, panel two. There's a lot of things that happen in that gutter, in that blank space between those two panels. And when you read a prose book, the author tells you what's happening. It tells you how they got from chapter one to chapter two. It tells you, which is fine, but in a comic book, there's a lot left up to that reader's imagination that they have to make sense. They have to make meaning, and they have to pair the words with the images. So they're looking at body language, they're looking at facial expressions, they're looking at the colors that are being used to set the tone. They're also looking, so a lot of times studies have shown that when we read books, prose books, unless a character is specifically described, in America, we're envisioning a white character, a white male character. In a comic book, in a crowd, you can draw in somebody wearing a hijab, you can have somebody in a wheelchair, you can have all different colors, all these sorts of things in one panel. If you were to do that in a prose book, it would, be encyclopedia size just to describe what's happening in the world around that person. So when you put that all together, that level of imagination, I very much think, allows kids to really interpret things on their own. It's no different than listening to hip hop or music. Is that song means different things to different people, and or poetry, and that's okay. It's just, why do you think that way? How can you explain it? Can you defend your reasoning? And so when we take all those things, and when my students create their own comics, so they'll do things like, after we read March, they'll create their own comic book based on a civil rights issue of their choosing that's going on in the world today. And they do a lot of research, and they do an annotated works cited page, and they have, all the historical type things, but then they have an imaginary situation that they've created, and they create a world where this issue can be solved in a realistic way. And so that ignites their imagination, because it's not something that has happened. It's something that we hope will happen. And I think that level of imagination, I don't know, you just can't do it when you're just using a textbook.
Yeah, and I feel like what you just spoke about culture was also so very important because that again took me back into when I first saw Batman Begins, and how he goes to Nanga Parbat to learn different skills from Raja Gul. And it showed a lot of depiction of the Himalayas and me living in Pakistan. That was really inspiring that, oh wow, like Batman is coming to Himalayas to learn about skills and crafts. So I feel like that culture appropriation and identifying and mentioning and describing different cultures is really important in comic books, and it's really inspiring to see.
Yeah, and it's not just the characters. I mean, what the diversity that we're growing up with, my kids are growing up with, in terms of, you know, um, bisexual, transgender, black, Hispanic, Muslim, all these different characters that we have. But we're also seeing that the artists and the authors are also very diverse now too. I mean, G. Willow Wilson and Sana Amanat, who were the co-creators of Miss Marvel, one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite superheroes, right? You've got a 16-year-old Pakistani American girl from New Jersey.
Yeah.
um, and she's fantastic. And so when you read through the comics, you learn a lot about her culture, um, in a way that she's not she fears that she has all these weird holidays, and what winds up happening is we all have these weird holidays and family traditions, and so her being Muslim is an important part of who she is, but she's not a Muslim superhero. She's a superhero who is also Muslim, and I think that's a really powerful thing. And I showed my students every single year, and I've had the pleasure of meeting G. Willow Wilson a few times. She's so awesome. She gives this TED talk called Generation Y. And she talks very much about how when Marvel approached her to create the character, how terrified she was about getting hate mail and death threats and all the things that really didn't happen. That it really showed the strength of America, who we are. Yes, make no mistake, we're going through a lot of awful things too with racism and et cetera. But it's these kinds of stories where like I said, my kids are growing up with these characters where, like I said, Hulk, who's now called Braun, is Korean, or you've got like Priya's mask. So you've got this, superhero from India, or you've got all these different people that is just normal to the current generation of students. And I really do think in the next 5, 10 years or so, we're going to see some major changes in terms of who we are in the United States as a nation. Because and maybe it sounds cheesy, but I really do feel that comic books are the vehicle, for us to learn all these things.
Yeah, definitely. The comic books are really important in this perspective. In terms of students, there have been researchers coming out that academically a lot of students are struggling as compared to the previous generations. How true is that, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so we're very much seeing a lot of behavioral issues, for one thing, a lack of consequences, for students, and that needs to change. Where, and I don't mean like something happens so we suspend them automatically, but there's this lack of, I think, self-respect that students have for themselves. And so that all comes down to building that community, the impact that they're having on one another, the learning environment, things like that. But then also you factor in, of course, things like math and reading and writing, before COVID, with COVID, all these sorts of things. And my response is always reading is reading, right? Comic books are literature. If a kid is annotating a poem, if they're annotating a comic, if whatever it is, we need to find a way, to engage the students. Again, comic books are just one tool, but I think for me, they're a very important tool to use, that forces students to think in a way that they haven't. Um, I don't have all the answers, for how to fix the education system, not just in the United States, but we're seeing it around the world right now. Um, but I think incrementally every year things are getting better. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so my daughter is going into college in the fall, and she was accepted into an honors program, and she's going as a history major. And it really is that she grew up in a house of books. She grew up in a family culture where we talk about books, we read books together, we read books about all different experiences, different people, cultures, things like that. And it is what has made her empathetic. It is what has made her have, a better understanding of the world. And she says to me, she goes, Dad, I can tell you the biggest difference in school right now is the kids who read and the kids who don't. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that we're fighting against, TikTok and social media. And I'm a big social media proponent. I'm not, totally against that. But I think for us as parents, I think for us as educators, we have to show students, like we already talked about, turning electronics off. Here's what we're doing with this lesson plan today. Here's how we're creating. Here's how we're reading. Here's how we're thinking. Here's how we're questioning. And I think unless we're more willing to do that, as parents, that we shut the devices down at home and we read. Like I love, if my children are reading a book that they love, I'll buy a copy and read the book with them. And I do the same thing with my students. If a kid has a book out on their table, I'm asking them, why are you reading that book? Tell me about that book. And that is a huge experience for them. And more times than not, I'll buy the book and then I'll talk about the book. And I book talk every single day in my classroom, whether it be a prose book, a poetry book, a comic book, whatever it might be. And I think we need to be that model for kids, and more of a literacy model, create a community of readers. And I don't see that enough.
Yes, I believe parents need to be more engaged too and need to be more proactive too with either consequences or how the kind of atmosphere that they foster in their homes.
Agree.
I also feel like with technology evolving and kids' minds being stimulated so consistently and so constantly, it's decreasing their attention span, and teachers have to adopt more creative techniques like you are doing, so to keep them stimulated, to keep them engaged in sessions.
Yeah, so it's something that I fight against sometimes where we talk about brain breaks, that students can't sit still for more than 10 minutes, this, that, and the other. A attention span is like anything else, we can expand it, we can work on it. We have to be really intentional with what we're doing. So if we're giving students a brain break every 10 minutes, we're just reinforcing, and I'm talking on a high school level, it's different levels, things like that. So it's not just the attention span, but it's also getting instant answers. If they're doing everything on the computer, it doesn't allow the students time to sit and think and be comfortable with the idea that they don't know something. So when they're given a page, a panel, a what have you, and that's all they have, they don't have their phone, they don't have a computer, and they want to come up and ask me immediately in the beginning of the school year, well, I don't know what this means, Mr. Smythe. And I'm like, okay, go back down, sit and think. And over the course of the year, we're expanding their self-reliance, their self-confidence, and their attention span. And there are still many, many students, my children included, who love to sit and listen to an engaging speaker for a half hour or more, who love TED Talks, who are tired of being interrupted every 10 minutes for another brain break, for another icebreaker, for so we have to reach all the different kids, and we can't forget the quiet introverted kid who does like to sit and think and reflect and do these things. And I think we've tried to meet the technology too much, where again, we need to be purposeful in giving the kids time to feel uncomfortable, to know that they may not know something, and that's okay, and to figure it out. And so, first step is try to figure it out on your own. Second step is talk to your partner. Third step is then come and talk to me as the teacher. And that's a hard thing for me to sit back and watch students struggle sometimes. But struggling is not a bad thing. I mean, I'm not just never interacting with them. I'm not never answering their questions, but they have to show me first what's your thought process, why you're thinking that way, how are you trying to figure this out on your own.
Yeah, and have you seen kids struggling a lot these days with mental health issues like either depression, anxiety, or self-esteem issues?
Yeah, and I'm not a licensed therapist or anything, but having experience personally through therapy, I think in a lot of cases, so you've got the impact of students seeing things on social media that are embellished or are not true, people only sharing the positive things. And so you've got that jealousy, you've got the, oh, I'm so awful because I don't have this, I didn't do that sort of a thing. And you're not sharing the reality of the other 23 hours of that person's day. And so we have to talk to our students about that. Be careful about what the people you're following, be careful about what they're sharing, and don't internalize that. And I don't think we talk enough about those things in our classroom. We need to teach them to be media literate. So we have to show them how to say like what's fake. And so when we see these scary things online, when we, okay, what's true, what's not true, how do we figure these things out? How do we empower these kids to do those things? But we know, a lot of the fights that we have in school, it's because of something not that happened in the classroom, but something that happened on social media. And I hear students talk about it all the time. he liked that, and she's my girlfriend, and he blocked me, and she didn't follow me back, and like all these things that I didn't have to deal with as a young person. I can't imagine how stressful all these things are. And I think again, that's where the parents come in. We eat dinner together purposefully. I'm lucky that I live in a family where my wife and I and my kids are kind of on the same schedule, and we can do that. I know not every family can do that, but that family time is so important to talk about those things, figure out what's going on, have your kids talk to you about these sorts of things. But I also think with the depression and the things that we're seeing, we're not teaching the kids how to do these things on their own, right? How to figure these things out on their own. That a lot of times it's immediately, I need to go to guidance, or immediately I need, because they're feeling stressed. And we're not letting them know that good stress is a real thing, that it's okay to feel stressed sometimes. How do we deal with it? But again, I'm also very honest about myself when I get to doom scrolling on social media, that I suffer from social anxiety and depression myself. And I think we also too many times in schools we tell kids like, well, just smile, just choose to be happy. And I think we're really doing a disservice there. And I say to the kids, like, you have every right to be angry and to be sad, and you have the right to feel these things. You're going through some really real things. But how do we process to get out of those places? And I don't think we're doing that enough. But I also think when we read these comics where these superheroes are going through some really real world issues and problems, I do think it opens up the door to have these conversations about these types of issues.
And I think that's spot on because you did start by saying that although you're not a therapist, but everything that you spoke about it are beautiful interventions that families and parents can utilize. What are some books or what are some lessons that you would recommend to a mental health therapist or a social worker working with different young kids, old or older kids?
Gosh, there's so many great ones that are out there. Um, but anything from like El Defo from CC Bell is a comic book about a kid. It's an autobiography, growing up deaf and using that deafness as a superpower because she has an FM system with a microphone, and so she can hear things that the kids around her can't hear. There are books on. So for me, Speak from Laurie Halse Anderson. A lot of people don't even realize that there's a graphic novel adaptation. For me, who this is a loose autobiography from her experiences of being raped in ninth grade. Um, so for me, having some sexual violence in my own past, there was a panel in here, one page that just absolutely struck me in a way that prose never did. And I literally saw myself on this page. So I've had the privilege of getting to know Laurie, and we've done some work together. I wrote the teacher guide for the book. We've presented together. And I said, this made me feel comfortable about talking about some of these things. And what she said to me was, oh, we're family now, your experiences. And so that kind of a book in a counselor's office, it doesn't have to be, here's all it can be, okay, read this book and let's use that book like we said, like you said, where it's a comic book or play therapy, whatever. That book becomes a medium to open up those conversations. um Sunshine, Jarrett Krasaska, is about him volunteering to work at a camp where kids who have cancer, and it's devastating, but it's also full of hope. And the idea is that instead of giving up, how do you make the most out of life? And that comes from his first book called Hey Kiddo. So Hey Kiddo, Jarrett Krasaska, this is autobiography, graphic memoir, and it's about him growing up where he had to live with his grandparents because his father wasn't in the picture. His mother was addicted to drugs, alcohol, even turned to prostitution. Um, and it's been banned in some school districts. And what Jared always says is, I'm not the only one who has this type of a childhood. There are other kids. So you can't say it's not appropriate for sixth, seventh, whatever grade when there are kids in sixth and seventh grade who are going through these things. And for them to see someone like Jared who became an author, who shared his truth, who does all these things, it's a really empowering type of a thing to do. I mean, I won't get into all, but I got a whole stack here, but books like Chunky, about being overweight and being picked on. And so you can literally see yourself in there. Books on being autistic, like Sensory is a great graphic novel. The Cardboard Kingdom, which is about just one image about being transgender. When Stars Are Scattered, there's a graphic novel about being a refugee, and there's all kinds of great books now about immigration and being a refugee. This is a book I had at my classroom, the DC Book of Pride, just all the different LGBTQ characters. I mean, there's so many, and there's I'll do like three more but Lighter Than My Shadow is about anorexia.
Mhm.
This actually opened up conversations with a family member and me, and we were able to do it by reading the book together. Then there's last two, Last Things, Marissa Moss. My father died from ALS, from Lou Gehrig's disease, and this is about her experiences losing her husband. And I talked about this in my classroom, and it turns out we had a kid, very angry kid, in ninth grade, and we couldn't figure out why. His dad had ALS and was dying from ALS. No wonder the kid was so angry. And it was by me opening up about my own experiences that he then opened up about what was going on, and we were able to get him some help. And then the last one of my favorites is I Kill Giants. This is about a girl whose mother is dying from cancer. And in her mind, she goes out and she battles these monsters. And it turns out what she's really fighting against is what her mother's going through. And what she's really afraid of is her mother in that bed at home dying. And it's just such an emotionally powerful book. So I could talk for hours on different book titles. The point is that they're out there.
Yeah.
And if you don't know as a teacher, I always say, ask your students. A lot of times they'll give you some really great recommendations.
Thank you so much for sharing such a wealth of knowledge and with such a huge wealth of references and recommendations. I may get a little greedy here because I provide a lot of therapy services to a lot of low socioeconomical background folks and a lot of DHS cases as well of Homeland Security where kids are separated from their parents and are either living with foster families or are living with grandparents and stuff. And they start developing a lot of self-esteem issues. They start developing a lot of self-hate towards themselves, lots of questions. What would be some books that you could recommend or that you could advise for a therapist or a social worker to use with them?
So oh yeah, so here's like Remy Lai, Pie in the Sky. So this be for younger kids, but it's great because I'm trying to look at one of the pages. I wrote about this in my own book. Um, but they're immigrants to the United States, and on the pages, so it's both prose and drawings, but they see people on the subway as these creatures who are speaking this language that they can't understand. Um, and then they flip it back as the people see them as kids who don't speak English, and I think this visualization. But there's all kinds of great there. Laura House Anderson wrote a Wonder Woman book called Tempest Tossed, and it's about the modern refugee crisis told through Wonder Woman, who tries to get involved through the United Nations that try to help herself as an immigrant, right? Herself as somebody from another island planet, not from man's world kind of a thing. And it gets into child trafficking. It gets into adolescence of girls and growing up and being uncomfortable. It's another one would be I highly recommend is New Kid from Jerry Craft. So this is the first graphic novel to win the Newbery Award, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah, the Coretta Scott King Award and others. But Jerry writes about his experiences and that of his own boys of living in the inner city in New York in a black neighborhood and going to a white private school with wealthy kids and feeling a lot of self-doubt and not fitting in and talking about having to code switch, having to act differently at home than they would in the school. And so again, there's so many different titles, but it's you give a kid like this you want to talk about these heavy topics, right? And you want to get into these things, but you hand a kid a comic that looks fun, that's engaging, that is still hitting these topics on, and it opens up those conversations. So again, there's so many more ones to talk about, but those are just some of the ones I happen to just have sitting around here.
Yeah, thank you. Have you seen a rise in anger among kids at your school or in your district?
We did like 3 years ago. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but we had a lot of fights in our school, a lot. The police were there a lot. Um, and it hasn't been that bad the last few years. And I think because our administration and our teachers were very purposeful of one, tackling the cell phone problem. And so students are not allowed to have their cell phones in the classroom. Um, and it was a bit of a struggle at first, but the students are actually, I think, grateful to have that break, that mental break, that anxiety break from their phones. Um, and just how we're handling things. And we're empowering our students by having them meet with administration, with the school board, sharing what they're going through. We have representatives and all these different things. So yes, the anger is still there in some cases, but I have to say every year I'm seeing it get better and better. The farther we get away from what COVID did to, the shutdown, what it did to everything. And so in that case, I do have a lot of hope, but I still a lot of reasons to be concerned for sure.
That's really good that the trend is coming down because over here, majority of the cases that come up for at our clinic are related to anger issues where parents are struggling with kids and they're getting dysregulated, they're screaming, they're throwing things, slamming doors, and all that stuff, and becoming very defiant also in a lot of cases, which is why I asked. You've written your own book as well, which is called Teaching with Comics and Graphic Novels. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, today's the 2 year anniversary of the book. And it came about because, like I said, I do all these presentations and things, and everybody kept saying, you have to write a book, you have to write a book, you have to write a book. So I wrote a book, and it's not like full of education jargon. It's not full of like all that kind of stuff. It's just about what I do in my classroom. It's about my 3 kids and their experiences. It's about my students and their experiences. My thought process was to make a resource that teachers could use, ideas that they could use in their classroom the next day, that it would make it more accessible. So specific things that I've like literally have done in my classroom, and the things that have worked. And last year it was nominated for an Eisner Award, which is like the big award in the comic book industry. And so that was a big thrill. And I'm working on another book now about reading and writing in the content area classroom, but that writing that book really was, an act of love, I think, for me. And it was easy to write, quote unquote, easy to write, but it's based on 20 years of experience. So, and I always try to encourage teachers to share what they're doing because we have to help inspire the next generation of teachers. Because Lord knows we need teachers now, around the world, but also in this country. Um, and we also need to show people what we're doing in our classrooms. So we can blog, we can vlog, we can YouTube, we can podcast, we can write books, we can do all these things. Because if we don't share what we're doing, we're letting other people control the conversation about education in our country.
Yeah, all the best for your upcoming book. All the very best for that. And I'll attach up a link to Amazon from where folks can also refer back to your first book because I'm pretty sure not just educators, but a lot of parents would benefit from it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was a thought too. Because, like I said, I have stories in here about my own children and my son, who was termed a reluctant reader, and how comics helped him to overcome that stigma and fall in love with reading and all those things. So, yeah, it really is also for parents, homeschoolers, but it's also, anything from pre-K all the way through up university. In fact, last year I taught a course at the University of Pennsylvania for graduate students using my book as the textbook for the course. And that was a really cool experience too. So
That's really cool. Now you're doing incredible work in terms of fostering communities and in terms of empowering communities. When you deal with your own struggles, how do you manage your own struggles and how do you cope up with them?
for me, a lot of times I mean, and people know, like, total social media break. A lot of times that helps beyond anything else, and trying to keep up with everything. And really, for me, my release is to sit and read a book. Um, and whether it be a comic, whether it be whatever it might be. But for me, that and listen to a good playlist. And I like to share a lot of my music with my students too. There's no easy answer, but therapy certainly helps. Talking with people certainly helps. I wish I had understand the power of therapy. Like for me, when I was, a young person, if you were to talk about going to therapy, it was seen as, a stigma, something was wrong with you. You didn't talk about those sorts of things. And so I never got any help. And like I said, it went up with me being so depressed that I wound up dropping out of college. And if it wasn't for the person Joan, who's my wife, like literally saving me and taking an interest and befriending me and making me believe in myself again, I don't know where I would be. And so I talk to my students about that all the time, that, you break a leg, you go to the doctor. If you want to get in shape, you talk to a personal trainer maybe. And if you're having mental issues, you go see a doctor that can help you with that, a therapist who can help you with that. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think this current generation is much, much better with that. And so I think for that reason, for folks like you, who I have all the respect for, I think that that's going to help very much with this generation. And like I said, I think in the next 5 years or so, we're going to start seeing some really positive changes.
I hope it does because I keep telling everyone that regardless of how rich or how poor you are, there is going to be a time in your life when you're going to struggle with mental health, or you're going to struggle with something where you may need someone else's assistance. You may be a lone wolf, but you will still need someone else to support you, guide you, or just have your back in certain situations and moments in life. How important do you think sharing these kinds of stories from teachers is to students? Because a lot of times teachers focus a lot on what the material for the class is and don't become humanistic, or don't share personalized stories with students. How important do you think is it for the students to hear these stories?
That's a tough question, because if you don't feel comfortable doing it, you certainly shouldn't. And there are teachers who share too much about their personal lives, and they can go too far the other way. Um, it is a tightrope to kind of walk down there. And there's things that I won't say to students, of course. And there are things, and I say to the students, I am not your therapist. There are times when I'm going to need to, okay, you said this, so we're going to need to get you help, right? And so as an educator, I am a mandatory reporter for abuse and things like that, as I think educators should be. Um, and I also caution too that a well-meaning teacher who doesn't understand how to do these things can actually cause more harm than help. And so there needs to be more professional development. I wish therapists would come in, and not just to talk to the students, but to talk to the teachers. Um, what do you do when a kid says this? What do you do when you're reading a kid's paper and you see that? How do you handle these things? And I think we need to empower the teachers, but I think we also need to have that line where teachers need to understand that you are not a therapist, that you are the teacher. So I don't think we're there yet. I think we need more of that pairing with the professional community of therapists and counselors and things like that, with educators, not only for our own needs, because mental health of teachers is not very good right now either, but how to deal with these things in the classroom. So no, it's not a matter of embarrassment or shame if, as a teacher, you don't have these conversations with the students because you're not comfortable with it. That's okay, because it's also okay for students to not share as well. I never want a student to feel like, we write comics about an important day in their life, and it could be anything from, something traumatic that happened, to they winning a baseball game, to winning a video game, to whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And I think that's an important thing that we need to understand too, that I think sometimes we say, oh, this is a good idea, let's jump in 100%, but not everybody's going to feel comfortable doing that, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's very beautifully put, and I completely agree with you on that. You really have to understand where you stand and then go on from there, and also analyze and look at who you're addressing it to, or what your crowd is, or who the students are. A lot of times I've seen, because being a therapist at school, I've seen that a teacher might be great. They might be having the great session with, let's say, 20 out of 25 of their students, but there might be a couple of students that they might struggle with. How can a teacher overcome those struggles, or how have you overcome those struggles in your profession?
So I am white, I am male, I am Christian, I am straight, I am cisgendered. There's not a lot about me that kids who are struggling with identity that I can connect to because of who I am. Comic books and posters and music, when kids come into my classroom and they see a book about a transgender story, I don't have to stand in front of the classroom and say, if you are fill in all the blanks, I love you, I'm here for you. It is literally when you walk into the classroom on the first day of school that you're like, okay, I feel seen in this classroom. Um, and so it's not that I have to talk about heavy topics every single day. It's just that by being very purposeful in what is in my classroom, the voices that I use in what we're studying, whether it be historical letters or videos, it is if I'm showing videos in my classroom, are they all some white male talking, or am I trying to find some representation of the people who are doing the teaching, whether a YouTube video, whatever it might be? And I think when I do those things, students feel comfortable with me in a way that they wouldn't be able to. I don't know that I could talk that much about the issues on the first week of school that would have anywhere near the impact of simply just having those materials there.
Mhm.
And the pictures of the people that I have met in the comic book community around the room. I had a student came, her father was a military attaché from Iraq. And so the family came over here for a couple of years. His father was helping with the US military, and she saw a picture of me with G. Willow Wilson wearing a hijab, and she said it was the first time I felt seen in an American classroom. Um,
Oh.
so yeah, I think we, and I say this all the time, we really need to take a look around our classrooms and what are we seeing there?
Definitely. And I feel like that goes outside of the classroom as well, because cultural representation and identity representation is really important. And it receives a lot of backlash on social media at times when there is a different cultural representation around a specific character, if their skin color is changed or something. But people should still push back. People should still unite, because these are all stories that need to be told, because they get identified by other people.
Yeah. And like Captain America recently had, I mean, of course, Sam Wilson. So Captain America has been a white male, has been a black male. You've also have had a Native American Captain America. You've also had a female Captain American, a gay Captain America. This idea that anybody can, hold the shield and put on a costume. And I again, I think that really opens up and Spider-Verse. Like there is a spider for everything. Like there's an Indian Spider-Man female. Like, I mean, it's everywhere. Um, and yeah, people are going to push back, and that's fine. And it's people who look like me, and it's people in my age group that are, in a lot of cases, are doing the pushback. But it's this current generation growing up with these heroes that to them it's completely normal. And I think, like I said, we're going to see a lot of change and a lot of progress.
I hope so. I really hope so. How do you envision the future of comics in education on a global scale?
Uh, so my fear is always, paper comics disappearing and we read everything online, which could happen. But I think what we're going to see is not as many single issues of comics. I think we're going to see more of, storylines put together into whether we call it a graphic novel or a trade paperback, whatever it might be. But what I'm seeing, because again, I've had the opportunity, and you spoke about Pakistan, about, the importance of comics in the culture is really anywhere you go in the world, comics are integrated in the culture. It's only been in the United States, in my experience, that there's been this stigma of comics being literature only for kids. But I think through these books that we're seeing now, these graphic memoirs, that books about the Black Panther movement or the civil rights movement, all these things, I think these authors have really, and illustrators have pushed the needle towards this is literature. And that's what I say all the time. So I think we're I still get pushback sometimes from art teachers or English teachers or parents. Um, I started this journey in like 2007, and there was a lot of pushback then. I don't get anywhere near the amount of pushback anymore. And then I also think when these kids who are growing up with these books are becoming educators themselves, as I teach college level comics courses, as I'm seeing comics majors, as I'm seeing all these things at the university level start to change, I really do see in the next few years, there's going to be very few people left that are going to be able to say, comic books aren't real reading. And that makes me really happy.
That's amazing and really, really good. Uh, what would you recommend to, let's say, a teacher who's starting up fresh in their career? How can they integrate comic books as testing waters or to start or begin up from somewhere?
Yeah, that and I say that because I had a reputation in my district, still do, as somebody with really high expectations. I can be a little bit of a hard nose in terms of, what I expect from students to achieve, because I know that the students can. When I had that reputation, then I shifted to using comics. And I think it helped because people who were giving pushback knew who I was, right? I didn't start on day one with, here's all these comic books. And I think if you do that as a new teacher, you might struggle a little bit. So I think it's the idea of easing into what you're doing. I also think you have to be very purposeful in what you're doing. It cannot be here, read some comics because they're fun or because it's a hook. You have to be really purposeful in why you're choosing those comics and how to read those comics and what to get out of those comics. You have to be prepared to defend the use of those comic books. Like you should be able to defend any resource you're using in your classroom, because if you're observed, if a parent complains, if all those things that happens, you have to be able to defend that. And again, it's knowing how to do those things. Again, I'm not a comic book teacher. Comic books are one of the things that I use in my classroom. I wish in some cases it would be the only thing that I could use, but there's so many other resources out there. Um, but I think it's just trying one or two things in the beginning. It's doing a survey of students in the beginning of the school year. It could be something as simple as who's your favorite superhero and why. If you could be a superhero, who would you be and why? What's your favorite book that you've read? What those types of questions, and then if you share your own experiences about those things. And there's a part on my website, teachingwithcomics.com, where anytime I find free comic books that are available online that are good for use in the classroom, I put them there. And so you don't have to go buy 30 copies of a comic or of a book. A lot of times there's something in there that you can use for free in your classroom just to get the conversation started. Or it could be a lot of times I'll use one panel from one page from a comic book, and I use that to open a conversation. We don't read the rest of the comic. It's something that we can use as like a do now to open those conversations. So again, I think you start slow. You don't come in on the first day dressed as Batman and all that kind of stuff. You have to kind of test the waters, like you said, kind of know your audience and what you're working with.
Yeah. And in your profession yourself, have you faced a lot of criticism from parents?
No, I honestly, I really haven't. When I when I first started doing this in my school, I did get a little bit of pushback. I'll just say from some people, so I can keep my job. Um, and then PBS reached out to me, Vicky Pasquantonio, who's an editor at PBS, and asked if I would write a blog about what I'm doing. She liked what I was sharing on social media, and I said sure. And so when I did, it gathered all this great attention, and my district shared it on their social media. And parents were, I hope my kid gets him, and this is so amazing. And it changed the conversation. What happened was these two people weren't mean, they weren't out to get me. They didn't understand the comic books, right? They didn't they and it at the time they just didn't understand the literary value. But so that article came out, and so one of those people asked me if I had any evidence on the efficacy of comics in the classroom. And I said, well, yes, I do. Here's my master's paper that I wrote when I became a reading specialist. And ever since then, the district has been great about it. And we've bought some graphic novels for the classroom and things. So again, it's not that these people are my arch nemesis or they're not anything like that. It's that lack of understanding. And I'm seeing that lack of understanding going away in education because of the work that people like myself and so many other educators are doing by sharing these things. And so, yeah, I would say in the last 10 years or so, I have gotten nothing but very positive support and feedback.
Love to hear that. You mentioned that comic is one of the things that you implement, and then the other thing in some of the sessions is also music. What are some of the music playlists that you share with your students?
So I always talk to my kids about Public Enemy. So as an eighth grade white kid growing up in Philadelphia, and it took a nation of millions to hold us back. Really, Chuck D just blew my mind. These are issues that we weren't talking about in my social studies courses. We never made it past the Vietnam War when I was in school. Like that was as far current history as we got. And so I started learning about, these issues that are going on. And so I talked to my students about that. And so then what I do is, and it's funny because I've gotten to know Daryl McDaniels from Run DMC, and a lot of times my kids don't know who he is. So but it allows me to share the influence of hip hop on me when I was a kid. And so then I take that and we annotate some songs. So we talk about again Nat Turner's Rebellion, and we talk about slavery in the United States. And I use some Public Enemy songs where the kids annotate the songs and they make connections from the 1800s to the 1980s, and the connections and the things that are going on. And then I say, okay, what songs are you listening to today that you feel are pushing back against injustice in the world? And I get country music, I get hip hop, I get pop
Mhm.
music. I've gotten nursery rhymes, I've got all kinds of things from the kids. And then what I do is I put that together into a playlist. So it's not just my music, it's music that the kids have shared with me. And I say, listen, like, you know, we're in high school. If you send me a song that's got cursing and things like that's great. I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to report you or anything like that. I'm not going to share it in the classroom if I can't find an edited version. Like, let's be realistic. But more times than not, I can find a version that we can use and we can play. But all of a sudden now you've got all these kids from different walks of life who are listening to different genres of music, realizing that in a lot of cases, music is used to push back. And so when we talk about, music during the Vietnam era and all these things, but we're talking about it today, whether it be like people like Common, who's a fantastic artist, or all these different places. But I'm getting older. I don't know a lot of these current artists anymore, and it keeps me fresh because I get to learn from the kids too.
That's a beautiful initiative to connect up with the kids and to grow up that community within the classrooms. Because just similar to comic books, I feel like music is also a very powerful tool that you can utilize to connect with the people that you work with or the people that you teach. What are some other creative techniques that you would recommend that teachers can trap in their classrooms that you may have tried?
Uh, I'd
You
like to,
mentioned arts and crafts also a little bit.
yeah. So a lot of times I'll have the kids pitch me an idea where I'll say, all right, this is the product that I want. What's another way that we could do it? And the example I always give is before I started really getting into this kind of stuff was I had the kids do research on medieval castles, and they would build a castle and they would write a research paper on it. And it was funny because sometimes you would know who the parents were who had the power tools because they would come in with these amazing constructions, but it gave the kids the opportunity to work with their hands, or to work with a parent or whatever it might be. But then I had a kid come up to me and asked me if he could do his project in Minecraft. And my initial reaction was, I said, no, that's not the same amount of work as somebody who's this, that, and the other. And then something in me said, yeah, and I went back and I talked to him and I said, let me, because I knew nothing about Minecraft. And this kid did the most amazing project I've ever seen in my life. I can't even imagine how much time it took him. And the classroom the kids were absolutely just amazed as we watched this kid walk us through his castle and explain everything about portcullis and all the different things that he learned about. And every once in a while there's like a random sheep would run through, like that kind of stuff. And it really taught me a lesson that I don't know everything, and that students can like sometimes they'll make a book trailer, or they'll make a song. They'll create a song from a historical event. They'll create a poem. They'll create. So I'm really open to different ideas. But we do that too. Like we do World War One. The kids read World War One poetry, then they create their own poems, and then they create their own visuals. Some kids have created dioramas. Some kids act things out. All these different things. And I know myself as very much an introverted type of a person. If I had to was forced to act something out in the classroom, I would be terrified. I probably wouldn't go to school. And so by leaving it open to, okay, here's what I want you to do, but you tell me a different way, I think has been a really powerful experience for me.
Very true. And I feel like I've seen that in my practice as well. And I encourage that to parents too, that all of us possess special powers, special interests, special energies. And all we have to do is tap into those. And that's a lot what I try utilizing play therapy for, in terms of finding up that focal point, finding up that interest point on how can I let, or how can I make this client communicate or connect with me, because or how can I make them use this special interest as a North Star or as an anchor point to overcome the struggle that they're going through.
Perfect. Yeah. Um, like for instance, like I have my kids do research papers, and like college level, high expectations research papers, but they get to choose the topic that they want to do it on. And so something that they're passionate about, something that they get to share, and then I get to learn from them too. We also take historical figures. I shouldn't say historical, contemporary people who have made an impact on the world. And my students turn them into a superhero. And they write a biography and an origin story, and who would be on their superhero team, who would be their enemies and why, like real people. And so in one class period, when the kids present, we can do 30 biographies of people that I would never be able to get to in a regular social studies classroom. And then the kids create them and they draw them, or they use online tools, or sometimes they create 3D figures and action figures and things like that. So again, like you said, it's finding that thing that gets that hook that gets them excited about what they're doing.
Yeah, because like all of us have that focal point, and sometimes people figure it out or find it out at an older age. But if we can help and assist kids in finding out at a younger age, it would benefit them a lot. To wrap things up a little bit, you mentioned that you have been working with the U.S. State Department. What are some projects that you have worked with them, and what are some other projects that you are manifesting and building for yourself?
So the U.S. State Department program was ended. And what we did with that was we taught American culture, the English language. That was the intent, and American pop culture to students and educators around the world. What was cool is what wound up happening was I learned so much from the people that I was interacting with, learning about the comics that they were reading, students that were creating comics and talking about, whether it be Ramadan or whatever it might be. And what we found out was comics kind of eliminated the language barrier, the culture barrier. It was a really neat experience. So I'm forever thankful for that. In terms of current projects, I honestly, besides working on my new book, I've kind of taken a step back and have kind of refocused my energies in terms of I've taken on new coursework at my school and new positions at my school. And so it's kind of actually nice. I still do writing guides for, like I said, Scholastic Macmillan. I'm on the advisors committee for PBS NewsHour Classroom, so I get to interact with that. And I do some other side projects and things like that. But as my daughter's getting ready to go off to college and all those sorts of things in my life, I've kind of taken a little bit of a step back in terms of any giant projects right now.
Well, I'm really excited for your upcoming book, and all the best to your daughters on their future endeavors. Um, and just for how can people reach out to you? How can people find you? I'm gonna definitely link up all your social media outlets, links in the description below, as well as your website. But if you can just talk a little bit about how can people reach out to you through those.
I guess the easiest way is my website, which is teachingwithcomics.com. I'm on I was going to say Twitter. I still call it Twitter. At History Comics, Instagram at History Comics, on TikTok, Teaching with Comics. I run two Facebook groups, Teaching with Comics and Comic Book Teachers on Facebook. And I'm on the other ones too, like Mastodon and Blue Sky. There's so many now, it's hard to keep up with. My email is historycomicsguy@gmail.com. If you want to bring me out for a professional development or to do work, or if you have questions, what have you. But yeah, I'm pretty easy to get in touch with.
Perfect. And as I said, that all the links would be in the description for Tim. My last question for you would be, what are some comic books that you read to feel calm yourself or to relax yourself in some time, or some comic books that you always might go back to and reread again and again?
Well, what's great is I've been going to so new comic books come out every Wednesday, and I've been going to the comic book store with my kids since they were, I mean, toddlers. And so every Wednesday, we do that as a family. And it's such a great and it's all about literacy. It's all about reading. It's all about those sorts of things. And so now, my youngest is going into ninth grade. I have a son who's going into 11th grade. And so, we read and share a lot of these things together. So every Wednesday, I'm always reading comics. There's just so many. Like, I mean, you can see behind me, this is just some of the comics that I go back and reread and things like that. I don't have a favorite superhero. I don't have a favorite book. It's always a question that people have and they want to know. Just like I don't have a favorite song. I just whatever kind of moves me. But what's nice is I have publishers who send me books all the time who want me to review and share and things like that. So my to be read pile is always huge. Um, my kids help me to read them and things like that. So, and that's the thing. I'm always learning about titles that it always surprises me that I had no idea that even existed. And so that's always a suggestion I have is if you're not sure about these books and titles and things, go to your comic book store and say, hey, I have an interest in this. And they are so helpful. There's something out there for everybody to read.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, for being such a beacon of hope and for bringing up so much of positive influence, not just within your community, but all around. Because I saw you through the work that you had been doing through Twitter, but your work echoes globally. So thank you so much for doing that, and thank you so much for coming on the We Are Mentally United podcast as well today.
No, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. And I'm so excited to hear that it's being used in therapy. It's exactly what I would have needed when I was a kid. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we can record up a part two where we dive more specifically into different mental health disorders and what books you'd recommend for folks to read around them, or for therapists or social workers to read around them, because you have huge encyclopedia of knowledge, and I would love to showcase more of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Have a good one.